Because of intervention. But because interference stopped. The dam gates returned to normal operation, adjusting gently with seasonal changes rather than fighting constant overload. Pressure readings normalized. The system relaxed, no longer compensating for mistakes it hadn't made. What remained was the lesson. Not written in legal briefs or engineering manuals, but in warped foundations, empty cabins, and a shoreline that refused to be reshaped again. The HOA had believed authority could replace understanding. That paperwork could override physics. That confidence could substitute for respect. They were wrong. Nature hadn't acted out of spite or intention. It hadn't chosen sides. It had simply responded to conditions, exactly as designed. The warnings hadn't been threats. They had been explanations. Ignored. In the end, there was no dramatic confrontation. No final argument. No victorious speech. Just a quiet aftermath where consequences settled into place as naturally as water finding its level. The cabins stood as monuments to assumption. The lake stood as proof of balance. And the land, unchanged in its indifference, reminded everyone involved of a truth older than any homeowners association could ever be. You can build wherever you want on paper. But nature is the one that signs off in reality. The land was supposed to be quiet. That was the whole reason for buying it in the first place. A stretch of property just outside a growing subdivision, technically neighboring an HOA community but not governed by it. It wasn't flashy land. No manicured lawns or decorative street signs. Just open space, uneven dirt, and potential. The kind of place where ownership actually meant something. For years, the land had been ignored. It sat there while the nearby HOA neighborhood expanded, adding identical houses, smooth sidewalks, and carefully enforced rules. The subdivision relied on a single access route that cut across a narrow portion of land bordering the property. It had always been used casually, almost carelessly, with the assumption that it would always remain available. That assumption would later become the HOA's biggest mistake. The decision to build a road wasn't impulsive. It came after months of planning, surveying, and legal checks. The landowner wanted reliable access to their property year-round. Rain turned the dirt into mud. Heavy vehicles struggled. Future development plans required something permanent. So permits were pulled, contractors hired, and every step followed local regulations to the letter. The road was built entirely on privately owned land. No HOA property. No shared easements. No crossing into subdivision-owned space. Just asphalt laid down where dirt and gravel used to be. Clean, functional, and legal. Construction didn't go unnoticed. From the moment the equipment arrived, attention shifted. Neighbors slowed their cars to stare. HOA board members took photos from a distance. There was a noticeable change in energy, the kind that always comes when control feels threatened. The road wasn't just pavement. It was independence. And independence tends to make HOAs nervous. At first, nothing happened. The road was completed smoothly. Contractors packed up. The landowner finally had proper access, and everything seemed settled. That calm didn't last long. A letter arrived. It was formal, stamped with HOA branding, and written with the kind of authority that assumed compliance. The notice claimed the road violated HOA standards. It cited vague rules about unauthorized construction and community impact. Then came the number that turned irritation into disbelief. A fine. $300. The HOA had decided that building a road on private land, not governed by them, still somehow fell under their authority. The fine was framed as a warning, with implications that further action could follow if it wasn't paid promptly. What stood out wasn't just the amount. It was the confidence behind it. The HOA genuinely believed the landowner would fold. That the letterhead, the legal language, and the threat of escalation would be enough. But the landowner didn't panic. Instead, they started reading. Every document tied to the property was pulled out. Deeds, surveys, boundary maps, county records. Everything was reviewed slowly and carefully. The road's placement was checked again. Measurements were verified. Nothing crossed HOA land. Nothing violated any shared agreement. The HOA had no jurisdiction. That's when something else became clear. The road wasn't just access to private land. It happened to overlap with the only practical entry point the HOA neighborhood used for certain services and traffic flow. It wasn't officially acknowledged, but functionally, the subdivision relied on it far more than anyone had ever admitted. Garbage trucks. Maintenance vehicles. Emergency access routes during construction phases. Over time, convenience had quietly turned into dependency. The HOA had fined the wrong person. Instead of paying, the landowner responded by doing what HOAs rarely expect. They stayed calm. They documented everything. They contacted the county. They consulted a property attorney, not to start a fight, but to understand leverage. And leverage existed. The HOA's fine wasn't just invalid. It exposed how casual they had been using land they didn't own. No formal easement. No agreement. No legal right to enforce anything. Years of assumption had replaced actual authority. The landowner didn't reply immediately. Silence can be powerful, especially when the other side expects fear. While the HOA waited for payment, plans quietly shifted. Signs were researched. Barriers were considered. Local regulations were checked again, not just for the road, but for access control. The law was clear. Private land meant private decisions. Meanwhile, the HOA escalated. A second notice arrived, more aggressive in tone. The fine was restated. Deadlines were emphasized. Consequences were hinted at. The HOA board clearly believed pressure would work if they just pushed harder. What they didn't realize was that every letter they sent strengthened the landowner's position. Each threat documented their overreach. Each demand confirmed they were acting without authority. The situation was no longer just about a road. It was about control. HOAs thrive on unchecked assumptions. On the idea that no one will challenge them. That most homeowners won't read bylaws, won't check property lines, and won't involve lawyers. This case shattered that expectation. By the time the landowner decided to respond, the response wasn't emotional. It wasn't loud. It was calculated. The HOA had drawn a line by issuing a fine. The landowner was about to redraw boundaries, literally. As preparations began to assert full control over the road, the reality slowly started to sink in for the HOA. The pavement they thought they could regulate wasn't theirs. The authority they assumed didn't exist. And the access they relied on was suddenly at risk. They had tried to collect $300. What they were about to lose was far more expensive. The HOA didn't realize it yet, but the moment they sent that second notice, they had already lost control. What they thought was escalation was actually exposure. Every demand they made rested on an assumption that no one had ever challenged before, that access meant ownership, and convenience meant authority. Behind the scenes, the landowner was moving carefully. No dramatic announcements. No public confrontation. Just paperwork, confirmation, and patience. County offices confirmed what the documents already showed. The road was fully within private boundaries. No easements were recorded. No shared access agreements existed. The HOA's long-term use of the road had never been formalized. It had simply been taken for granted. That realization changed everything. The road was no longer just infrastructure. It was leverage. And leverage, when used quietly, is far more powerful than any threat. The landowner began by filing formal notices, not to the HOA, but to local authorities. Notices clarifying ownership. Notices asserting responsibility and maintenance rights. Notices establishing intent to regulate access moving forward. Everything was done by the book. Everything was documented. At the same time, physical changes were planned. Nothing aggressive. Nothing confrontational. Just clear indicators of private property. Signage was ordered. Barriers were researched. Regulations about controlled access were reviewed to ensure full compliance. The goal wasn't chaos. It was clarity. The HOA, meanwhile, grew impatient. They expected payment. When none arrived, they assumed delay tactics. They were used to resistance crumbling after pressure. Homeowners usually gave in by this stage. Board members discussed next steps, convinced they were still in charge. Then the first sign appeared. Confusion. Residents noticed it before the HOA did. Drivers slowed down. Maintenance crews hesitated. Delivery vehicles questioned their routes. Something that had always been open suddenly felt uncertain. The HOA responded internally with dismissal. They told themselves it was a bluff. That no one would actually restrict access to an entire neighborhood. That the road was too important to touch. That assumption would cost them dearly. Over the next few days, access changed subtly. Not blocked. Not closed. Just regulated. Certain vehicles were redirected. Non-essential traffic was discouraged. The road remained functional for its owner, but its availability to others was no longer automatic. The ripple effect was immediate. Garbage collection schedules were disrupted. Contractors servicing HOA homes had to reroute. Emergency planning committees suddenly realized their primary assumptions about access were flawed. The HOA's infrastructure depended on something they did not control. Panic didn't set in publicly, but it was there. Emails flew between board members. Legal questions were raised. Old records were searched, desperately looking for proof of an easement that didn't exist. None was found. That's when the tone shifted. The HOA stopped talking about fines and started talking about cooperation. They reframed the situation as a misunderstanding. They hinted at compromise. They suggested discussions. But the landowner didn't rush. They knew something the HOA was just beginning to understand. Time was no longer on the HOA's side. Every day without clear access exposed their vulnerability. Every disrupted service raised questions among residents. Control, once shaken, is hard to regain. The HOA eventually reached out through formal channels, requesting a review of the situation. They no longer mentioned the $300 fine. It had quietly disappeared from their communications, as if it had never existed. Instead, they focused on the road. They wanted access restored. They wanted assurances. They wanted things to go back to the way they were. But the way things were had never been legal. The landowner responded with documentation. Surveys. Deeds. County confirmations. Everything laid out cleanly, professionally, and unemotionally. There was no accusation. Just facts. The HOA was forced to confront reality. Their authority stopped at their boundary lines. Their years of unchecked use meant nothing without legal backing. And the road they depended on was never theirs to regulate. Internally, blame started to circulate. Past boards had failed to secure easements. Legal counsel had never flagged the risk. Convenience had replaced due diligence, and now the bill had come due. Residents began asking questions. Why hadn't this been addressed before? Why was access suddenly uncertain? Why was the HOA fighting a battle it clearly couldn't win? The board tried to manage optics, but the damage was already done. Confidence in leadership wavered. Meetings grew tense. The road had become a symbol of overreach, and everyone could see it. Still, the situation wasn't resolved. The landowner had leverage, but leverage only matters if it's used decisively. And the next move would determine whether this ended quietly, or turned into a lesson the HOA would never forget. As negotiations stalled and pressure mounted, one thing became clear. The HOA had tried to assert control with a $300 fine. What followed was about to cost them far more than money. By the time the HOA realized how deeply they had miscalculated, the situation was no longer theirs to control. What began as a routine enforcement attempt had evolved into a structural failure of authority. The road, once an overlooked convenience, had become the center of a problem the board could not find its way out of. The landowner remained consistent. No emotional reactions. No public arguments. Every step continued to be measured, lawful, and documented. The goal was no longer to respond to the HOA's pressure. It was to finalize boundaries, legally and practically. A formal notice was issued clarifying access terms. The road would remain private. Any continued use by third parties would require a legal agreement. Liability, maintenance, and permissions would be clearly defined moving forward. What had once been informal and free was now structured and conditional. The HOA hesitated. They had two options. Accept reality and negotiate, or challenge ownership and risk public failure. Their legal advisors reviewed the case thoroughly. The conclusion was unavoidable. There was no easement. No historical claim strong enough to stand in court. No documentation that justified their demands. The fine was officially withdrawn. Quietly. No apology. No announcement. It simply vanished, as if it had never existed. But removing the fine did nothing to restore what the HOA had truly lost: credibility. Residents noticed. Trust in the board weakened further. Questions spread throughout the neighborhood about other assumptions the HOA might be making. If something this critical had been mishandled for years, what else had been overlooked? Negotiations followed, but from a very different position than the HOA had expected. They were no longer issuing demands. They were requesting access. The landowner listened. Not because they had to, but because leverage is most effective when paired with restraint. Terms were proposed that reflected reality. Shared access would require compensation. Maintenance responsibilities would be clarified. Liability would no longer fall on someone who didn't benefit from the arrangement. The HOA had no real counter. They needed the road. Alternative access routes were expensive, slow, and politically difficult. Rerouting services would disrupt residents even further. The simplest path forward was agreement. And agreement came, on the landowner's terms. What made the outcome sting wasn't just the financial cost. It was the lesson. The HOA had attempted to assert power where none existed. They had relied on intimidation instead of verification. And in doing so, they exposed a flaw in their entire system. Control only works when it's legitimate. The road was eventually reopened under formal conditions. Access was restored, but authority was not. The HOA no longer dictated terms. They complied with them. The landowner's position was secured. The road remained private. Its value, both practical and symbolic, had increased. What began as a simple improvement to land access had become a reminder that ownership still matters, especially when someone assumes it doesn't. The HOA never mentioned the incident again publicly. It faded from newsletters. It disappeared from meeting notes. But among residents and local officials, the story lingered. It became a cautionary tale. A reminder that power should always be checked. That fines are not law. And that overreach, even when it seems small, can unravel authority entirely. All of it traced back to a single decision. To fine someone $300 for building a road on land they owned. The HOA thought it was enforcing rules. Instead, they enforced a lesson they would never forget.